All right, so we left off introducing the grammar of the forms of government, and it was pretty obvious from that metaphor of the house that by nature, doesn't matter which form you have, by nature, because of the Christian doctrine of sin, there's a disintegration process that happens. Well, now we're going to look a little bit more into that dark side of the moon, as I called it, those three perversions of the pure forms, that is, of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and that's shaded that way. And so all three of them lead to tyranny. So we're going to use the word tyranny in a more general way. And what we'll do today is we'll look at four sections if we have time. Number one, the perversion of the pure forms. Number two, the criteria for tyranny. And then thirdly, we'll start to switch gears and we'll start to look at power as a principal object of political theory. We'll look at a maxim of Aristotle. And if we have time, we'll get into the principle behind that, what's called the principle of subsidiarity, which really developed in the Middle Ages and especially from Catholic theorists. But let's look at the perversion of the pure forms first. And we'll just see this in a sort of Platonic way. And you notice I don't have the house, and part of the idea is there, we want to mix metaphors, we want to use different pictures, and here it's almost like a Venn diagram stretched out so that you see there's a mixture between them, because none of them really ever exist in a pure form. But the idea here is that you had closer to the being of them obeying this law, whether it's the people doing so, and you say, well, they never do so, or the king doing so, well, he never does so, or the excellent ones doing so, well, they never do so. And so you have the perversion of those three. And to use Platonic language, you would have the being of, and remember, it wasn't just the law in the Christian doctrine, it was the image of God was the ultimate object in the civil sphere. The law is there for that. So you have the being of justice, and then you have these participating in being. That's the word Plato would use. They're participating in being, but being corruptible, they become, or the word he would use, deprivation, a deprivation of being. So, each of these has an essence and then an accidens. Now, I won't use any more medieval metaphysical language, but that's what we would understand this to be, where you have the being or the essence of justice, and you have things that come nearer and further away from a just law or a just ruling or a just war. Okay? And so all the things that you may be thinking of as unjust, they may simply be the accidens. And we don't use that word in philosophy the way modern people do, but things that are secondary, not part of the essence of it, the things that it could do without. And so remember that when it comes time to, let's review week one, that we don't blame a distortion or some secondary quality of it that's not essential to the design. But what we're really going to focus on is the magistrate themselves coming nearer in their mind or further away from that essence of justice. So whatever belongs properly to the object of the magistrate's office is good and always to be obeyed. So you're right thinking of Romans 13 right now, right? But violence against the image by the magistrates is accidental, not essential to the form. And that's exactly the kind of language, both Platonic and Aristotelian, that someone like Samuel Rutherford used. And even if you don't use that language, that's essential to understanding Romans 13 the right way. So now, since none of these three are the pure form of the Republic, the pure law upholding the image, it follows that pressing any of these three as if they were the essence, as if the vote or the man or the representation, as if one of those three accidens were the essence, that will do something analogous to what we saw with liberty and equality when they're torn from their eternal moorings. It becomes something very different. Rutherford says it like this. He says, quote, Power and absolute monarchy is tyranny. Unmixed democracy is confusion. Untempered aristocracy is factious dominion. In other words, backbiting in those secret rooms. And he says, and neither reason nor scripture shall warrant any one in its rigid purity without mixture. You get the idea that none of these three are the point. Now, we don't get that today. Today, we think that maximizing political liberty, that is my power to choose something in the political realm, is the point. But as we saw, that's actually violence against the image of God. And so you have the perversions of these: tyranny, oligarchy, and what I called mobocracy. Now, these are opposite in being. These ones down here, these are opposite in being to their original. As Rutherford says again, a king and a tyrant are, by way of contradiction, contrary one to another. And we saw this with democracy as well, that to press it as if it were the essence of the republic pits a circumstance against an essential element. My choosing versus what? I can choose to rob you. That would not make it just, because I've maximized my choice. If we want to call the right to vote a right, we have to understand it's a very different kind of right than what we saw inheres in the image of God in nature. That is life, liberty, and property. So life, liberty, and property are more essential, more foundational, more God-glorifying to maintain than the right to vote. Believe it or not. I know that offends our modern sensibilities of egalitarianism, but it is a necessary consequence of the biblical view. So a vote is ambiguous with respect to its object. Life, liberty, and property are concerned with themselves. If they turn outward to abuse, it takes much greater momentum over a greater time. So let's talk about divine justice as a form here. And I'm only going to use one color because it'd just be distracting if I do anything else. And I might just keep this up there the whole time until we get to those criteria for tyranny. But when we talk about this, again, we talked about this being the objective thing. I'll put that up there. I know it can sound very abstract. And we also use the word the republic, but all we're getting at in any of this language, it's the being of what? In this case, it's justice. The objective thing, the eternal essence of what is just. And something that is just in society, we saw from the Martin Luther King Jr. quote or from the Cicero quote, is that the human law conforms through natural law, through our reasoning about it, it conforms to eternal law. Okay? And so how does it do that? Well, in biblical terminology, it does this through the second table of the law, Commandments 5 through 10, which hold out God's image as the basic object violated by breaking them. So, I don't know how you would put this. Don't make too much about where this swings on this line, but think of the fifth, you would have the image's authority. The sixth, you would have the image's life. The seventh, you would have the image's marriage. The eighth, you would have the image's property, and let's just cap it at the ninth. With the ninth, you would have the image's good name, or in other words, reputation. And these are all connected. We saw life, liberty, and property were connected. You attack one, it's connected. You attack one of these, you start, and it's not a slippery slope argument. You can start to show how you can't attack one without attacking the other. And so a program that puts one of those circumstantial rights above the objective thing is violence against the image of God. And I know at this point it still sounds maybe a little abstract. It'll get more concrete when we start to introduce constitutional law, when we start to introduce economics. You'll start to see, oh, okay, I can see that in the concrete, how that's the case. But all of this requires intellect. And as I said, that's what John Adams was getting at when he said this Constitution is wholly inadequate for any other people than a moral people. Now, of course, there's virtue in there and character, but what he also means is moral intelligence, the ability to know, to perceive this, and to care about perceiving it. Again, Rutherford, building on that Reformed tendency toward the objective clarity of truth to all, says, as the scriptures in all fundamentals are clear and expone themselves, so all laws of men in their fundamentals, which are the laws of nature and of nations, are clear. He's going to make an analogy between seeing this and seeing Scripture. He says, tyranny is more visible and intelligible than heresy. Rutherford's saying is that if the church has a responsibility to understand heresy and throw the false teacher out, it also has the responsibility to see tyranny and throw the tyrant out. And he's going to say that it's clearer to see. That doesn't mean it's more important to do. He's not elevating physical things above spiritual things. However, he is saying this should be easier to see than heresy, which is interesting because oftentimes today it's not. In asking whether the magistrate be the sole, supreme, and final interpreter of the law, Rutherford adds, quote, I think it not unlike to the question whether the Pope and Romish Church have sole and peremptory power of exponing laws and the Word of God. You see that analogy there? Sola Scriptura to this citizenry seeing this law. The necessity of a philosophically competent citizenry to keep guard of the object. And this is one of the main contributions of Reformed theology to liberal democracy, to use that word in the early modern sense. And that is that I answer the charge of Rome or a political tyrant that you're just going to have a million different interpretations and you're going to have ignorance and you're going to have people going this way. It's going to be anarchy. That is a legitimate concern. But we answer a million subjectivisms not with one, but with objectivism, with objective truth. The bottom line is this: if there are some things which, if you don't know, will get you killed. And that's true in doctrine, and that is true in political matters. You need a philosophically competent citizenry to keep guard of the object. What does that mean? That means they see the essence of justice. They see the form of the city. What used to be called liberal education in the classical mode is crucial to a free people. One example is how theology is to be done at the concept level in Romans 13, just as much as in anywhere else of scriptural exegesis or doctrine. We do theology at the concept level, not just at the word level. As Rutherford reached back into the same view of Romans 13 that John Knox held to. Sorry, my clock here is going crazy, and I have to reach over there. If you see me reach over there, I have a clock, and it's freezing up the screen every 2 seconds. I don't understand it. But John Knox, in his History of the Reformation in Scotland, said, quote, there is a great difference, old-fashioned word, betwixt the authority which is God's ordinance, the persons of those, and the persons of those who are placed in authority. And so what he's going to say, and maybe I should draw this up, is that when you talk about the essence of justice, now I'm going to have to erase all of this. So let's do this. If I was going to put the form of anything versus the concrete, which you think, oh, more real. No, less real. The physical representations are less real than the essence of the thing itself. And so the essence of the thing itself is the office, represented by that sword, right? That's the office. That is the thing to which our obedience is aimed. And the particulars, Nebuchadnezzar, Nero, etc., Charlemagne, all the way down to the line to the present day, these are the instances or examples of them. They can conform more or less to it. So immediately, a philosophically competent citizenry to know when they are more and less conforming to it. Okay? Now, at this point, we have to ask the question, which will come up again and again in different ways later on. When we lose that, when we just focus on the particulars, are the image of God, and me seeing what that is, which is harder to see, and an ideal state, are those ever at odds? And one of the things we're going to introduce here, we talked about progressivism and mere conservatism or traditionalism in legal theory, but really those show up as a psychology of your whole political theory, to the degree that you don't think in classical terms. You're stuck down here on the floor in particulars, either moving this way or this way. And here we don't call that progressivism and legal, or whatever you want to call it, originalism or something else. Here we would call it, let's call this nostalgia over here, and let's call this utopianism over here. Okay? Let's just use those words. And I want to advance the argument, and we're going to get in great detail about this when we talk about the theory level of people's visions of politics. Is there a tension here? And to the point where you're not actually going to get the good things that you want. Okay? Now, utopianism is no such place. That's what the word means. And it sacrifices the real image of God for some future unknowns. Good things plucked from their context. And then if utopianism is no such place, nostalgia is no longer place. And there you sacrifice the real image for a past that is unrecoverable. Now, why am I bringing this up here? Because, and here's my answer, is because that is the most enticing thing, one way or the other, from thinking like a human. Those are the most enticing things that get our mind off of the object itself. And so one of the questions we want to ask on a practical level is, must the conservative choose between true liberty and some memorable mold of it in the past? Well, I'm for liberty. I'm for when there was liberty. Okay, sometimes, in fact, most of the time, you have to choose between those because you can't have both. You must choose between the preservation of life, liberty, and property on the one hand, as opposed to some past or patriotic ideal. And we certainly see that today with two massive people groups with diametrically opposed worldviews, violently opposed and not giving an inch, and yet nationalistic nostalgia forces that boiling pot to persist on the burner. And for what? For what? When you could peacefully dissolve that union along those worldview lines and get that peace and end the hostility. Now, I brought that up as a footnote, but I bring it in because that's going to stay with us everywhere else we go. And so now let's look at tyranny as a critical deprivation. Tyranny as a critical deprivation. So we're going to just follow the same course, and we're going to get to this point, and we're going to ask the question that's probably already come up, which is, okay, but where do we draw the line? When do we know when there is tyranny going on? When have we reached that point? And what follows from that downward path, that natural path, remember, is the loss of form. And when you have the loss of form, you have a loss of legitimacy. Let's call this the line of legitimacy. the line of legitimacy. Now, why is it that when you have a loss of form, at some point, not right away, not uncharitably so, why do you have a loss of legitimacy? Well, it's because if the form of law is upholding the image of God, and that's God's law, remember, not just man's law, then it follows that the deprivation in the form is increasingly disobedience to God. Remember those commandments I just put up there? To go down and down and down and sink in there and commit violence against the image of God is disobedience to God. And so when we get to this line, we're getting a more and more and more, don't lose sight of that, it's a more egregious disobedience to God. If the natural power behind government is that life of Genesis 9, 5, and 6, well then the civil use of the sixth commandment prohibits the loss of a republic. Let me say that again. And Charles Hodge draws this out in his systematic theology. He moves from self-defense as a subsection of the sixth commandment to the defense of a nation. What's true of the self is true of the people, that you have a responsibility to do that. And so another way to say that same thing is that the sixth commandment prohibits the loss of a republic. Think about that for a second. As that would be, it's called democide, the killing of a people group. The democide of a tyrant, or on the flip side of the same coin, the suicide of the people. If they have ability to stop those people, remember Proverbs 24? If you have the ability to rescue those people and stop them from going off to slaughter, you can't say to God, we did not know. That is disobedience to the sixth commandment. And so when we get to here, we have another word that is often used, usurpation. Now here, the sword, the usurper, usurpation is, let me give you just a garden variety definition, is the wielding of the sword, or the grasping of the sword when it is not yours to wield, or sitting on the throne when it is not yours to sit on. But suppose somebody's already holding the sword. Can such a person already holding the sword up here commit usurpation? And the answer is yes. The sword is up here. There's an essence to it. If it degrades, even in the hands of one person, then it falls away from that form to a critical level. Rutherford says on the usurper, quote, "Now if this be true, that a king turning tyrant loseth title to the crown, this is either a falling from his royal title only in God's court, or it is a losing of it before men, and in the court of his subjects. Now if the former be said, he is no king, having before God lost his royal title, and yet the people are to obey him as the minister of God, and the power from God, when as he is no such thing." So if he loses it, if what we mean is he loses that authority in, you can't say, oh, just in God's sight. Who would say it like that? Because you'd know what you're saying and say, but he's only illegitimate in God's sight, but we still have to obey him because what? Because I thought the reason we had to do it was not to incur God's wrath. That's the language of Romans 13. Althusius adds to this, quote, "For the wicked life of a magistrate does not invalidate his royal authority, just as a marriage is not dissolved by every misdeed committed by one made against another, unless it is the misdeed of adultery, because this is directly contrary to the nature of marriage. So not every misdeed of a magistrate deprives him of his scepter, but only that in which he, having accepted and then neglected the just rule of administration, acts contrary to the fundamentals and essence of human association and destroys civil and social life." You get the idea that Rutherford and Althusius had thought this through, and there's a line, and they're telling you where the line is. But you notice the analogy there. Let's get the forms of government off of that. I want to show you the analogy. The analogy, I don't have my eraser. You'll remember I told you that in the New Testament, there's a series of social spheres. The state's just one. Marriage is another. Your work is another. Church is another. And you always see a head. Let's just put a crown. You see a crown in each of these. Members of these covenants are told to submit themselves to the authority, but it's always qualified. Why is it always qualified? Because the essence is Christ alone. Remember the coin. Matthew 22:17 through 21. That the things that belong to God, what belongs to God? Even these crowns down here belong to God, which is why Paul and Peter always say, for the Lord's sake, in the Lord, as unto the Lord. There's a point when, as Althusius says, in the fundamentals, in the essentials, if the marriage is no longer a marriage, if the work is no longer the work, if the church is no longer the church, and as I go through those, hopefully you can see, oh, I know scriptures that form our doctrines of when a church is no longer a church, if it doesn't have those three marks, word, sacrament, discipline. Oh, that adultery, I see the, from Matthew 5:31 and 32, I see the analogy Althusius was making now. So can we say that there's a line, a point where the state is no longer the same state? Yes. And that's what they're getting at. And they're saying you have to be able to see this. Now, if you don't study civics, you can't see that. So if I'm a usurper of the sword, what do I want to do if I can create a school system and make it compulsory and make you study in that school? I'm going to take civics and logic, but especially civics, I'm going to get it out of there so that you can't see the essence of where my boundaries are. So, talking about criteria for tyranny, what both Althusius and Rutherford were narrowing in on is that object mentioned by Jefferson in the Declaration in the words, quote, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, image of God, God commanded it, don't change the subject and say, but Jefferson was a deist, I feel really dirty right now. God is the speaker in Genesis 9, 5, and 6. You don't have a right to do that. Jefferson may be a bad mailman, but the envelope is stuffed with something from the king. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. And what Althusius and Rutherford were saying is, well, and part of that's a piece of cake. Part of it's not. But the part that's a piece of cake is you don't have to do demolition work to put up a new foundation. There's nothing there. Now, it may be a big mess with rubble everywhere, but in fact, that same state is no longer a state at all. Sedition is off the table at this point. Is there a thing as sedition? Yes. But there's also a point when they cross that line of legitimacy, and that's not properly government that God has instituted when you see that mob at that point. Destructive toward these ends. Which ends? Which ends are Jefferson talking about? Well, again, the language of Rutherford and Althusius, the point about falling from authority in God's court, and the analogy to adultery and marriage helps with that. What we have, in other words, here's more language for you. What we have is a decisive, covenant-dissolving betrayal. You erase the lines of these circles. We have a decisive, covenant-dissolving betrayal. The covenant that is there in which sedition would make sense negatively, or which submission positively would make sense, has dissolved. The same thing, is not there anymore. And Rutherford makes this point by the distinction of the magistrate in Romans 13, treated in abstracto, he says, versus in concreto. And just a little Latin there for that same distinction that we've been making. Romans 13 is talking about both the design and the decree. God has decreed Nero and Charlemagne and Alexander and Donald Trump. He has he has ordained all of those. That's the decree language. But that's all, the statist or the pietist interpretation, that's all they hear. But know that there's design language that reaches into the whole biblical theology of the sword, and that's what Rutherford means by in abstracto, meaning the office, the sense in which it is Christ's. So that Paul treats him as God's minister mainly in the abstract and only secondarily in the concrete, or insofar as he acts on behalf of the image of God. He remains in concreto, and so we may, Rutherford says, give him due respect under many minor failings. Now I'm paraphrasing here, but when his regime becomes a bloodthirsty mob, such is not proper government. And remember the law of God here, very important. It's upholding that image. Crucial. Any government collectively and decisively set against these commandments is not a legitimate government. Again, you hear that all the time. It's not a big deal until they're telling you to disobey God. Commandments 5 through 10 are commandments of God. And at the very least, if you vote for and endorse those things, or if you're a pastor or whatever else, seminarian, and you bully Christians into voting that way, then at least those people are having you disobey God. But there's a spectrum there, and we could talk about that. Now, I don't have time to get into Aristotle's maxim, but that's okay because I think that's better as a separate session anyway. Here we just looked at the falling out or the line of tyranny. But that's good language for you. Critical covenant dissolving usurpation is where that line is. And if you ever get lost, but how do I define that? See the second table of the law, remember Genesis 9, 5, and 6, and if the sword is aimed at those commandments, and that's what the state's doing, that's not a legitimate state. It's not properly divinely ordained government. And so next time, we'll talk about Aristotle's maxim, we'll talk about the principle of subsidiarity and why republics should be small, and we'll start to look at that flow of power as a principal object of political theory. So that's next time.